The rain had started just after sunset, a slow drizzle tapping against the glass panes of my bedroom window. It wasn't a storm, just one of those lazy summer showers that cooled the air and filled the night with the scent of wet earth. I had left the window open, letting the damp breeze roll in, carrying with it the sound of distant thunder. The dim glow of my bedside lamp cast long shadows on the walls, their movements shifting with each flicker of the candle I had lit earlier. I sat on the edge of my bed, absently running a towel over my damp skin. My shower had been longer than usual, the hot water working to untangle the thoughts swirling in my head. It had been a long day, filled with unspoken words and lingering glances that I wasn't sure how to interpret. I had spent the afternoon with John, my best friend since high school, straight, confident, effortlessly charming John. We had spent hours playing video games, arguing over dumb things like whether pineapple belonged on pizza, and laughing over old inside jokes. But something about today had felt different, like an undercurrent of tension neither of us was willing to acknowledge. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on me a second too long when I spoke, or the way he sat just a little closer than necessary. Or maybe I was imagining things. I exhaled, shaking my head. Get a grip, man. John had left a couple of hours ago, or so I had thought. He had grabbed his hoodie, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and tossed me a lazy wave before heading out. But now, as I sat in my dimly lit room, the sound of the front door creaking open downstairs sent a jolt of unease through me. I frowned. Had I locked the door? My heartbeat picked up, the towel slipping from my fingers. I listened, straining to hear past the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving through the hallway, closer now. I swallowed, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cooling air running down my spine. Hello. My voice barely carried past my own room. No answer, just the quiet hush of breath. Then, before I could react, the door swung open, and there stood John. John froze in the doorway, his eyes widening as they took me in. I was still sitting on the bed, my towel lying in a crumpled heap at my feet, my skin damp and exposed under the dim glow of my bedside lamp. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sounds in the room were the soft patter of rain against the window and the faint hum of the ceiling fan above us. My pulse pounded in my ears, an unsteady rhythm that made my breath come short and uneven. "Shit," John finally muttered, his voice a rough whisper. His face turned red as he averted his gaze, looking anywhere but at me. I scrambled for the towel, yanking it over my lap as if that could undo the last 5 seconds. "Dude, what the hell?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but it was the only way to mask the swirling mix of embarrassment, confusion, and something else I didn't want to name. John ran a hand through his hair, still standing frozen in the doorway. I thought you were downstairs," he stammered, rubbing the back of his neck. "The door was open, and I called your name, but you didn't answer." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "So you just walked in?" He exhaled sharply. "I didn't mean to, man. I swear. I was coming to grab my phone. I left it on your desk." He motioned toward the cluttered wooden desk against the far wall. I followed his gaze, and sure enough, his phone lay there, screen glowing faintly from a notification. I hadn't even noticed it before. The tension in the air was thick, crackling like the humid summer storm outside. I could feel John's discomfort radiating off him, but there was something else there too, something that made my stomach tighten. He still wasn't looking at me. His jaw was clenched, his fingers twitching at his sides. An awkward silence stretched between us before he finally took a step forward, moving toward the desk. I watched him, unsure of what to say, what to do. A part of me wanted to make a joke, to laugh it off like it was nothing. Just two best friends, one walking in on the other naked. No big deal. But it was a big deal, because I wasn't just embarrassed. I was hyper-aware of him, of the way his broad shoulders tensed under his hoodie, the way he swallowed hard when he turned back to me. And most of all, the way my own body reacted to his presence in ways I didn't want to admit. John grabbed his phone, but didn't leave. He hesitated, fingers tightening around the device as he turned toward me. His expression was unreadable, something flickering behind his deep brown eyes. "You good?" he asked, his voice lower than before. I forced out a laugh, running a hand through my damp hair. "Yeah, dude. Just maybe knock next time." He nodded, but he didn't move, didn't leave. I expected him to say something else, maybe make an awkward joke to diffuse attention. Instead, he did something I didn't expect. He sat down on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight, the air between us charged with something unspoken. I swallowed hard, gripping the towel around me like it was my last lifeline. "Hey, His voice was hesitant, almost unsure. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, though my throat was dry. He exhaled, rubbing his palms against his jeans. "Do you ever think about things?" I frowned. "Things? Yeah." Like, he paused, his gaze flickering to me for just a second before he looked away again. "Like stuff that makes you question things." My stomach clenched. He was being vague, but I knew exactly what he meant. I had spent years pushing those thoughts down, pretending they didn't exist. But hearing him say it, seeing the conflicted look in his eyes, made my pulse hammer in my chest. "I guess," I said carefully. "Why?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't know, man. Lately, I feel like I don't know myself." Something in his voice made my breath catch. John had always been the confident one, the guy who never second-guessed anything, who went after what he wanted without hesitation. Seeing him like this, uncertain, vulnerable, was a side of him I had never seen before. "You don't have to have it all figured out," I said quietly. He sighed, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. "Yeah, but it's different with you." My heart stopped. I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair again, a nervous tick I had seen 1,000 times before, but this time it felt different. "You ever feel like there's something you're not supposed to want, but you want it anyway?" His voice was barely above a whisper. The word sent a shockwave through me. I stared at him, my mouth opening, then closing again. I had imagined this moment so many times, but never like this. Never with him looking at me like that. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath coming uneven. The air between us was suffocating, heavy with something neither of us wanted to say out loud. He turned to me then, and for the first time, he held my gaze. His eyes searched mine, looking for something, an answer, a reaction, anything. "John!" My voice was barely steady. He shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. The contact was brief but electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off. I should have said something, anything, to break the moment. But I didn't, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The rain outside grew heavier, the wind rattling the window pane. The storm was growing, much like the tension between us. And just as he opened his mouth to speak again, his phone buzzed in his hand. We both jumped at the sudden noise, the spell between us breaking. He glanced down at the screen, his jaw tightening. "I should go," he muttered, already standing up. "Yeah," I said, though my voice sounded distant. He hesitated, looking like he wanted to say more. But then he just gave me a quick nod before heading for the door. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me sitting there, heart pounding, breath shaky, mind racing with 1,000 questions I wasn't ready to answer. The house was quiet, too quiet. John had left, but his presence lingered, like an echo in the walls, a warmth in the air. I could still feel the brush of his knee against mine, the weight of his gaze, the tension that had thickened between us just before he walked away. I should have let it go. I should have shaken it off, convinced myself that it meant nothing. But I couldn't. Not when the air in my room still smelled like his cologne, Not when my pulse still thrummed with the memory of him sitting so close. I didn't know how much time passed before my phone lit up on the nightstand. "John! Hey, you up?" My stomach tightened. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the keyboard. It was late. He never texted me like this. Not after we'd already said goodnight. I hesitated before typing back. "Me? Yeah. What's up?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. My heart pounded as I waited. "John, can I come back?" I swallowed hard. This was a bad idea. I knew it, but my fingers moved before my brain could catch up. "Me." Doors open. Minutes later, I heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, then the soft creak of the front door, the quiet shuffle of footsteps up the stairs. I barely had time to prepare myself before my bedroom door eased open. John stepped inside, his hoodie pulled up, casting a shadow over his face. His posture was tense, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. But his eyes were locked onto mine, searching, questioning. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. "You okay?" He exhaled sharply, then shut the door behind him. "I don't know," he admitted. His voice was low, rough around the edges. I couldn't stop thinking about earlier. My breath caught. He stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I nodded slowly. "Okay." He licked his lips, like he was trying to find the right words. Then, softly, hesitantly, he said, "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different?" My throat went dry. Different. I knew exactly what he meant, even if he couldn't say the words. My fingers curled into the sheets, my pulse roaring in my ears. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say something that would make sense of this moment, this tension that had been building between us for longer than I was willing to admit. But I couldn't, so I just nodded. John sucked in a breath, his entire body going rigid. Then, before I could process what was happening, he took another step forward, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. I should have moved. I didn't. His eyes searched mine, flickering down to my lips, then back up again. His breathing was uneven, his hands twitching at his sides like he was fighting some invisible war with himself. And then he reached out. His fingers brushed against my wrist, tentative and unsure, like he was testing the weight of this moment. My skin burned where he touched me, every nerve in my body sparking to life. I didn't pull away. His grip tightened just slightly. "This is insane," he muttered, almost to himself. I swallowed hard. Yeah, neither of us moved. Outside, the storm raged on, rain hammering against the window pane, thunder rumbling in the distance. Inside, everything was still. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, John whispered, "Tell me to stop." My breath hitched. I should have said, "John, this is a mistake." I should have laughed it off, shoved him away, done something to break the tension coiling between us like a loaded spring. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at him. The way his jaw was clenched, the way his hands trembled slightly as they gripped mine, and I realized something terrifying. I didn't want him to stop, so I didn't say a word. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbreakable. John's fingers flexed against my skin, his body tense, like he was waiting for something, a sign, a reason to walk away. But I didn't give him one. I saw at the moment his resolve cracked, the way his breath stuttered, the way his shoulders sagged, the way his eyes darkened with something raw, something dangerous. And then he moved. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. My pulse roared in my ears. My skin burned. My mind screamed at me to process what was happening, to understand what this meant, but I couldn't. All I knew was that John, my best friend, my straight best friend, was standing so close that I could feel his breath on my lips. And neither of us was backing away. The storm outside reached its peak, wind rattling the house. shaking the very foundation beneath us. But inside this room, inside this moment, everything stopped. Then, just as John's fingers slid up my arm, just as the space between us vanished, his phone buzzed. Loud, sharp, a sudden jolt of reality. We both jumped. The moment shattered. John yanked his hand back like he'd been burned, stepping away so fast he nearly tripped over himself. His breath was ragged, his eyes wide with something close to panic. I stared at him, chest rising and falling in uneven gasps, my entire body still thrumming with electricity. The phone buzzed again. He fumbled for it, blinking at the screen like he had just woken up from a dream. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. It's my girlfriend. A knife to the gut. Of course. This was a mistake. He swallowed hard, shoving his phone into his pocket. I should go. I nodded, though I couldn't trust myself to speak. John hesitated. For a second, it looked like he was going to say something else. Something important. But then, just like before, he turned and left, leaving me standing in the middle of my room, heart pounding, hands shaking, body still aching from something that never even happened. Something that almost did. And that was worse. The silence in my room was deafening. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closed door like it might swing open again, like he might come back, like we could pretend that moment had never happened. But he didn't come back, and pretending wasn't an option anymore. My hands were still trembling, my skin still buzzing with the phantom imprint of his touch. I pressed my palms against my thighs, trying to steady my breathing, but my chest felt too tight. My room suddenly felt too small. John had almost kissed me, or maybe I had almost kissed him. It didn't matter. The space between almost and did was razor thin, and whatever we had just done, it had crossed a line neither of us was ready to talk about. The storm outside had died down to a soft drizzle, but inside, my mind was still a mess. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his parted lips, his wide eyes, the way his breath had caught just before reality came crashing down. His girlfriend had called. That fact lodged itself in my throat like a stone. Of course, he had a girlfriend. He was straight. He had always been straight. Hadn't he? I swallowed hard, running a hand through my hair. I needed to stop thinking about this. About him. About the way he looked at me before he left. Like he was just as shaken, just as confused. I reached for my phone, staring at our last conversation. John, can I come back? I exhaled sharply, debating whether to text him, to ask him if he was okay, if we were okay. But what would I even say? Hey, man, about earlier, about what? About the fact that he had touched me like he was afraid to let go. About the fact that I had wanted him to. My stomach twisted. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the bed. I didn't sleep that night. John and I always sat together at lunch. It was an unspoken rule, a habit formed over years of friendship. No matter what, we always found each other in the chaos of the school cafeteria or the noisy booths of our favorite diner. But today, when I walked into the dining hall, he wasn't at our usual table. He was with her, his girlfriend. I stopped in my tracks, something cold settling in my stomach. He was sitting across from her, nodding at whatever she was saying, but his expression was distant, detached. And then, like he could sense me watching, his eyes flicked up. For a second, just a second, our gazes locked. And I saw it, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the weight of what had happened tonight before still lingering between us. Then, just as quickly, he looked away. I swallowed against a lump in my throat and forced my feet to move. I sat at a different table, my back to him, my appetite gone. The meal passed in a blur of half-heard conversations and untouched food. I kept waiting for my phone to buzz, for John to text me, to say something, but it never did. I was at my locker when I heard his voice behind me. Hey. I turned slowly. John stood there, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. His expression was unreadable, but his posture was tense, his weight shifting from one foot to the other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, he cleared his throat. "We good." I blinked. That was it. That was what he wanted to say. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Yeah," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "We're good." He nodded, but it wasn't convincing. The air between us felt fragile, like the wrong word could shatter everything. He hesitated, like he wanted to say more. But then his phone buzzed in his pocket. His jaw tightened. His girlfriend. He sighed, glancing at the screen before tucking the phone away. "I gotta go." I nodded, even though I wanted to grab his sleeve and tell him to stay, to talk, to admit that something between us had changed. But instead, I just watched him walk away. And for the first time since we met, I didn't know if he'd come back. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and forced normalcy. John and I still saw each other. In the hallways, in class, in the places we used to occupy together like second nature. But everything had shifted. It was like standing on cracked ice, pretending not to hear it creak beneath us. We spoke in half sentences, unfinished thoughts, carefully choosing words that wouldn't bring us back to that night. But it was always there, lurking beneath the surface. I caught him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. His eyes would linger, his jaw clench, like he was wrestling with something he couldn't say out loud. But the moment I turned to meet his gaze, he would look away. It was driving me insane. And then one night, everything cracked open again. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that had been circling my mind all week. The house was quiet. My window cracked open to let in the cool night air. Then my phone lit up. "John, I'm outside." My breath hitched. I sat up, staring at the message, my heart pounding. For a second, I considered ignoring it, pretending I hadn't seen it, letting him sit outside until he decided to leave. But I didn't. Instead, I got up, grabbed a hoodie, and slipped downstairs. The porch light cast a dull glow over the driveway. John was leaning against his car, hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, his face tense in the dim light. I stepped outside, crossing my arms over my chest. "What are you doing here?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." I scoffed. "Great answer." He let out a humorless laugh. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I froze. I knew exactly what he meant, but I needed him to say it. "Thinking about what?" I asked, my voice quieter now. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time in days, he didn't look away. "You know what?" The air between us crackled with unspoken words. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. He took a step closer. "That night." "Don't," I cut in, shaking my head. "Don't bring it up if you're just going to pretend it didn't mean anything." He swallowed hard. "I'm not pretending." I inhaled sharply, my fists clenching at my sides. "Then what are you doing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just stood there, looking at me like he was waiting for something, for me to push him away, for me to say something that would make this easier, for me to let him off the hook. But I couldn't. Not anymore. "John," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "If you don't know what you want, then don't do this." A muscle in his jaw twitched. His hands balled into fists. And then he moved. Not a step forward, not a step back, but just enough. Enough for me to feel the shift, to sense the hesitation and the urgency tangled together. He opened his mouth. Then his phone buzzed. Loud. Obnoxious. His entire body went rigid. I didn't need to ask who it was. The answer was always the same. His girlfriend. He hesitated for only a second before pulling out his phone and staring at the screen. The glow reflected in his eyes, casting a shadow over his expression. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. I stood there, Watching him go, my chest tight, my hands shaking. He didn't say goodbye. He just drove off, leaving me standing there in the cold, wondering if he would ever come back, or if I even wanted him to.